All right, students, welcome back here again to this time 12.3. And this time we are going to talk about women and children in what we call the time frame of antebellum America. So we're going to try to see where their role falls when we are discussing the evolution of women entering the workforce, but also women's evolving role in the family. So we got a couple things to cover here. This unit is not necessarily long, but it is important because we start to see changes come about during this time frame from traditional roles that the United States is used to, especially when it comes to women's rights and children's rights. So let's start really quickly here on about effects of the new manufacturing on women. So Francis Lowell, he is one of the big manufacturers in the United States during this time frame, and he runs a number of textile mills, and he's looking for a way to lower the cost of labor in his textile mill. So he comes up with a rather ingenious solution, or at least he thinks so during the time frame. And he recruits women that live on farms, and it's not women like the mothers, it's the young daughters. And so he recruits these young ladies to come and work at his textile mills. And how he's able to accomplish this is he talks to these young ladies and he says, "Hey, look, your families, they're not necessarily doing financially great, so why don't you come here and work, and then you can send money home to mom and dad and make sure that farm is successful." So he goes about that process of hiring these young ladies. Now, another thing that he does while being able to do so is he pays them substantially less than what he would pay for with a man. Because again, during this time, women's rights are evolving, and so therefore they do not have necessarily the same abilities to push back against societal changes as men do, because for one thing, women don't have the right to vote during this time frame still. So they managed to go ahead and hire large numbers of women to come work at these textile mills. Now, one of the things, though, that they do is the worry that parents would have if they sent their young ladies off into a big city is what's going to happen to them? Are they going to be changed because of these wild and rambunctious men within towns, or would they become morally corrupt and go out and drink at seedy places and bars? And, they worried about their general moral welfare. And so one of the things that Lowell does is that he builds specialized dormitories for these young ladies to live in. And with that, they had these caretakers, these older ladies who would often live there with them and take care and ensure that the women would be morally in line, and also they would make sure that they engaged and created activities that would keep the young ladies busy. And normally these young women would stay and they'd work at these factories until they found a nice young man and were able to get married and start their own lives together, or some of the young ladies, they moved back to the farm after a certain amount of time. Either way, there was opportunities for them to be able to finally stake a claim in the world and be able to become somewhat self-sufficient, so that they would actually have the ability to make their own money and start their own lives. And again, what does this do? It starts to change the role of the woman, where she gains her own independence and her own power, which starts to change their roles, how they see themselves. They see themselves as no longer just simply reliant upon a man. And so they start to branch out a little bit. Now, however, it doesn't necessarily work out perfect for them, because as the machines get larger and harder to use, eventually these poor young women are displaced by cheaper Irish labor that would come in from overseas. So not only were the Irishmen cheaper to use and pay, but they were also stronger and could handle more heavy, burdenous tasks. So eventually these young ladies fall out of favor for individuals like Lowell. However, they do find jobs in other areas of the economy. Again, they're starting to move themselves free from these kind of normal social shackles. All right. Well, the other thing is that they start looking, once they're free from their shackles, they start looking for better rights and representation within the government. These women were fighters. They made sure that they went out there and they fought for their rights to be able to be heard and to be listened to. Women start taking on, again, additional roles. One of the roles that they start doing is they take on missionary roles within their churches. They go out into the wild frontiers and they teach Native Americans. They go down and they're one of the few people that are willing to engage and teach the slave population. Overall, they're highly active in their churches. And now, why is this important? Well, this is during the time of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening, of course, is another wave of revivalist religion within the United States. You see a massive transformation into the spirituality of Americans in general. A large number of new religions are formed, utopian communities are set up, and you see that women play a greater role within these religious societies that are established and grow. Also, there is a change in the ideas of what is moral and what is immoral. Starts to rise the temperance movement among the women who see their husbands often getting drunk on a frequent occasion, so they fight back against alcohol. They also see alcohol as a social issue too, where they believe it leads to a lot of the crime, violence, and immorality of people in general. Another thing too, though, during the Second Great Awakening, you see a rise in the abolitionist movement, people fighting against the immorality of slavery. And women really want to be on the forefront of this fight against the slavery. However, they are pushed to the side on a continuous basis by the male abolitionists. In fact, during one of the great abolitionist meetings, all the women who attended were forced up into the gallery and only able to observe what was going on in the debates on the floor without having an active role in it. And these women, they're not your standard fair woman where it's just she came directly from the farm, worked in a loom factory or a textile factory for a short amount of time working on a loom. Instead, a lot of these women pushing for these equal rights are highly educated women. And the women usually come from with well-to-do backgrounds, which means they a lot of times come from money. And so they are educated, they typically have means to support themselves, and they really want to be part of this movement in order to free the slaves. And so they really push for their voice in this. And when they're not granted it, they decide to take matters into their own hands. And one of the things that they do is they go to and establish a convention in Seneca Falls. And so what they do is Elizabeth Cady Stanton and her friends, they decide to go and hold a conference on women's rights. And so they get up there and they start to talk and debate. And if I remember correctly, there's about 200 women that attend and a couple men. There's not very many men, but there's a few that show up too. But one of the things is that they start to argue about is that they say, look at our position in the society. When we are living here, first off, we have no rights to vote. So that means we can't engage in the democratic voting system in order to push our view of what we think should be rights. And we can't have our voices heard on a greater level. Other things, though, that were problematic is that women, they couldn't own property in their own name. And lastly, married women were not entitled to their own wages. So if they had a job and they were married, often they would have to surrender their income to their husband. They didn't have independent control over it. Now, some of the younger women, of course, they did have their own control, but for the most part, many women did not control their own personal finances. And because you don't control your own personal finances, you can't buy property. If you can't buy property, you can't be a property owner engaged in greater wealth accumulation. And usually a lot of times when we look at different places in America, owning property equaled the right to vote. So as you can see, there's a number of reasons why women were restricted from these rights because it was supposed to keep them in line, of course, according to their males that were around them during this time frame. So what do they do? Well, they create what's called the Declaration of Sentiments. It's really similar to what the Declaration of Independence was, but it lays out the disagreements and the problems that women had with the government and their inability to gain representation with it. So they push this idea out there that we're going to fight for equality and that all men and women are created equal. That's one of the key points that they change up in this document, that they really push for equality of the genders. Now, while they did fight for this quite a bit during antebellum America, not a lot of things changed directly and quickly. Now, women in certain states were given the right to own property, especially as you get more to the western United States. Some states, such as Utah, allowed women to vote early on into the mid-1800s. And then eventually in the 1920s is when you have the 19th Amendment passed and when women actually gained the right to vote. But these women were on the forefront of fighting for this. They were part of the women's suffrage crusade. Suffrage, of course, meaning that they want the right to vote. They want to have the voice in the government so that they can change the laws to benefit them. All right, well, let's talk about children now. Children play a unique role during this time frame too. If you guys remember when we went back and we were talking about colonial America and colonial economies, we focused in on how boys would go and become apprentices so they could learn a trade. So they might go work at a shoe shop, they might work at a printer, they might work with a blacksmith. They'd learn some sort of skill that they would be able to translate into their own business eventually and be able to gain and accumulate wealth and have usually about a middle-class lifestyle. And this starts to change in the industrial era of America because soon machines do those jobs that the craftsmen did. So you have now shoe factories that can make a large number of shoes very quickly. You have metal factories which can turn iron into steel, and they can press the steel, and they can use large machines to be able to make large numbers of equipment and tools that the blacksmith used to be able to do. So you see this evolution and this change of how the economy works. And no longer do you have to work with an apprentice as an apprenticeship and maybe be there for 5 to 7 years. Instead, you could just walk into a factory, be unskilled labor, and they'd be able to teach you how to run that one machine, and then you'd be able to make some money for yourselves. So this right here changes the economic situations of young men. And so they have to adapt and they have to evolve in there too. Also, women, same time, they were working, but they were doing more things like learning how to make dresses, maybe house servants in some cases, up until they'd get married. And they'd be able to make their way relatively in a lower class lifestyle with lower amounts of money, but eventually it usually would find them in a position where they'd be able to meet the right young man to take them and marry them so that they would have some sort of economic advantage. Now, education also was not mandatory during this time frame. So boys would often enter in these apprenticeships sometimes as young as 8 or 9, usually about 11 or 12. And often if they were feeling dissatisfied with life, they could do something as rash as running off and joining a seafaring vessel and join up with the crew and serve on the boat for as young as 11 years old. So if you watch the movie I really like is Master and Command, Far Side of the World, if I remember correctly, that's how you say it. But you see young men on there that are like 12, 13, 14 years old that are serving aboard those vessels. That was not an uncommon thing in the seafaring era such during this time. So what starts to happen, though, is the death of the apprenticeship. So the apprenticeship starts to fade away during this time frame. Now there are certain skills like blacksmithing that is even needed out into the Old West because you can't set up a big steel mill out there. So some of those jobs do last and do linger. In fact, there's still men today that work as blacksmiths, like ferrymen who make horseshoes and such. But some of those jobs still exist, but for the most part, they start to fade away. And one of the things that they find, though, is that not only do these jobs fade, but new jobs arise. And some of these new jobs are not just unskilled jobs, not unskilled labor. They actually have to have some sort of education to go along with it. And so high schools were developed in the 1830s to train these boys. Now, we're not talking about high schools like you guys think of in the traditional sense. Instead, some of these high schools were more like a small quick start university. And in there they would teach you critical skills such as bookkeeping and accounting. And these are difficult and hard skills to master and grasp very quickly if you don't have a formal education. So the high school is to get you up to speed and then train you so that then you could leave and go out and find a higher paying job in the market. Jobs are shifting during this era. They're moving on and they're moving to more advanced, more skilled positions. You wouldn't necessarily have to go work in that hot, heavy, dirty factory and risk life and limb. You could be sitting in a nice little office as a bookkeeper managing that large steel factory's finances. Also, they needed skilled young men to work out on the rail lines, not just skilled men to lay down the tracks and the rails and be able to push it out there, but they needed men who could manage the men, manage the finances of going out there, and also manage some of the advanced machinery like the steam engines. The trains needed to be run. And also you start to see the push out of inventions such as the telegraph. So you needed telegraph operators. And then once things start getting pressed further and further out, more and more education is needed. And you start to see universities change. They used to be more of religious institutions or a law school. Instead, these other schools that start to be established out on the western frontier, known as land-grant colleges, because what they were paid for was by the government selling land, and then some of the tax revenue would be funneled back into these universities. And these universities were designed to teach people out on the frontier skill sets that would be beneficial. They would train farmers. I know it sounds weird, but they were teaching them more advanced ways of farming, how to cross-pollinate and how to grow bigger and more drought-resistant crops. Things like that were being educated, but also engineers were starting to be needed because we're pushing the rail lines out. So you need people to be able to design and build bridges and be able to clear away obstacles. So, and then at times be able to build such things as like the Erie Canal. You need people that are skilled, that can manage these large projects and be able to complete them and create them. So land-grant colleges really train a lot of these very advanced jobs. And lastly, with the expansion, of course, of high schools and colleges, you need more teachers. So a lot of teachers were also learning in these land-grant universities. So they become very important. In fact, a number of them still exist out today that's got their start. And so they don't just fade away. They become a pretty important infrastructure within the United States. And so all this training is going on. People are becoming more educated. During this time, there's a lot of push for educational reform. School years are now improved, extended. There's more definition of grade levels of what you're expected to learn during those time frames. And also there are lessons of morality included into this too. So schools were not just for education, they were also to train you how to be a proper gentleman and a proper lady going into the future and going into your new career. So a lot of these schools were really designed around teaching you education and moral benefits. All right, guys, that's going to wrap up this one, 12.3. And thanks again for joining me. Don't forget to do your bell ringer and your quiz. See you tomorrow, guys.